Following the first presidential debate, Donald Trump leads Joe Biden by 0.6%, according to 770 polls tracked in DDHQ and the Hills polling average. Trump has led in 6 of these last 10 surveys, Biden in 2, and 1 poll shows them tied. Comparing that to Real Clear Polling's average, they've got Trump leading by 2.7%, with Trump leading in 6 of the last 7 polls included here. And then finally, according to 538, they have Trump up 1.5%. Now, all things considered, while many of these surveys included in these averages did come in prior to the debate, it doesn't necessarily seem that the needle has swung that hard in favor of Trump, contrary to what we may have thought given Biden's disastrous performance. What matters, of course, though, is how the 2 major party candidates are performing in the key battleground states. In order to be elected president, a candidate must secure at least 270 Electoral College votes out of the 538 up for grabs across the country. In today's video, I will take you through the state of play in most of the competitive states that will determine the winner of the election, offering my own personal prediction ratings ranging from safe to lean to toss-up, and that takes into account all of the data available to us from past results, polling, betting odds, shifts and trends, demographics, and a whole lot more. Will either candidate see a post-debate boost? We'll probably have to wait a few weeks to know for sure, but this is how the presidential map is likely going to play out based on current data. Let's start by filling in all of these safe states for Donald Trump. Starting up here in the Mountain West region, we have Idaho, Utah, Wyoming, Montana, North and South Dakota, Nebraska at large, as well as the 1st and 3rd congressional districts, Kansas, Oklahoma. Down here, there's Alaska, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, Indiana, West Virginia, and finally, South Carolina. And then for Joe Biden, Washington, Oregon, California, and Hawaii down the Pacific coast, Colorado, Illinois, New York, Maine's 1st congressional district, Vermont, Connecticut, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, D.C., Washington, D.C., Rhode Island, and then Massachusetts. Each of these solid blue and red states have strong partisan leans in favor of either Biden or Trump and have not flipped in their allegiance since at least 2008. And going back even further, with the exception of Indiana and Colorado, the other 32 have consistently gone blue or red in every single election since 1996, so 6 straight cycles. Now looking at the Electoral College vote count here, Biden holds an initial advantage with 191 votes over Trump's 125. This is really just due to the fact that the Democratic Party's safe states here down the Pacific coast and then up here in the Northeast tend to be more highly populated than these safe Republican states spread out across the middle of the country. In fact, California, Illinois, New York, New Jersey, and Massachusetts combine for 126 electoral votes alone, more than all 20 of these safe Republican states combined. That said, once we add the likely states to both candidates, you're going to see that preliminary lead for Biden disappear pretty quickly. Likely states are those with a strong amount of lean toward a party, but where an upset may be possible if one candidate wins in a landslide. So in other words, while safe or solid states have a better than 99% chance of backing either Biden or Trump, and are therefore effectively landslide proof, these likely states have around an 85 to 99% chance of backing a given candidate. Before we do get started with the more competitive states though, please make sure to subscribe to my channel down below for more election analysis like this. And while you're at it, feel free to check out my forecasting website linked in the description at electionpredictionsofficial.com. This will provide you with more visibility into the heaps and heaps of data doing all of the work behind the scenes that made me the most accurate independent forecaster of the 2020 election. Let's start with Trump. I'm first going to place Maine's 2nd congressional district in the likely Republican category. Now, while Maine's statewide contest is influenced most heavily by its more urban and therefore Democratic-friendly 1st district, which backed Biden by 23 points in 2020, The 2nd District is the most rural congressional district in the entire country, and much more friendly to Republican candidates. It backed Trump by 10 in 2016 and then 7 in 2020, and the two polls surveyed here so far this cycle have the former president up by 14 and 20 points, respectively. If I had to project the 2024 margin, I would say a Trump win of around 9 to 11 points is probably the most likely outcome. Over in the Midwest, Ohio and Iowa will also join the likely Republican category. No surprises here after they voted for Trump by more than 8 points in 2016 and 2020. They've both trended very hard to the right over the last decade. Iowa has shifted 16.5 points to the right when accounting for the national shift since 2012, more than any other state, while Ohio has seen an 11.5 point shift, the 5th strongest. Considering these trends and the strong polling advantage that Trump has enjoyed in both states here in the early going, Iowa and Ohio have effectively been taken off the board for the Biden re-election campaign. And then moving right along down to the southeast, in Florida, where all of the momentum is with the GOP, Trump won the state by a 3.4 point margin in 2020, the largest margin of victory for any presidential candidate here since 2004. And it was one of just 8 states where Trump actually performed better than he did in 2016. And even then, more recently in the 2022 midterm elections, Republican incumbents Governor Ron DeSantis and Senator Marco Rubio both won re-election by landslide margins, at least by Florida standards, 19% and 16%. So while Florida had previously commanded more Democratic attention than perhaps any other state really in 21st century electoral politics, that simply won't be the case in 2024. Trump currently leads Biden by more than 8 points in 538's polling average. Florida is clearly on a slippery slope towards becoming a solidly Republican state, perhaps in future elections. My conservative estimate would pin Trump's 2024 margin at around, say, 6 to 7 points, but I think the range of outcomes here is actually pretty wide, and I would not be surprised at all if he ends up winning by 9 or 10 points when all is said and done. Over in Texas now, it also goes likely Republican. The Lone Star State has not voted for a Democratic presidential candidate in almost 50 years, and in spite of growing hype that the Democrats would flip it at some point this decade, Trump's 6-point win in 2020 dampened those hopes significantly. His margin did drop from 9 points against Hillary Clinton in 2016. It was the lowest of the 21st century, and Biden's 46.5% vote share was the highest for a Democrat in Texas since 1976, though it was still a disappointing showing for Democrats, all things considered, as Biden had polled within 1.5 points of Trump in the final polling averages, and several forecasters had Texas rated as a toss-up going into Election Day. Trump and the Republican Party's rapid gains among Hispanics, specifically here in the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas, has at least temporarily put a halt to Democrats' momentum in the state, even as you see the large urban and suburban areas here moving in large numbers towards Biden. A lot of Hispanic voters quite simply abandoned the Democratic coalition. Democrats had been benefiting from the state's rising population of college graduates, younger voters, and minorities, but Texas is 40% Hispanic, meaning that their losses among this demographic are especially catastrophic. Trump should carry Texas by a margin of around 6 to 8 points ultimately in 2024. So that completes the likely Republican states for Trump, and as I had hinted at earlier, they have completely evaporated Biden's initial electoral vote advantage, raising Trump all the way up to 219 electoral votes now, just 51 shy of the magic number, 270. Now, while the earlier 122 vote total from his safe states alone may represent his absolute minimum number, I would say that Trump still has a better than 95% chance of winning at least this many electoral votes, with each of these likely states included now as well. As for Democrats, we'll add a few likely states to President Joe Biden's tally as well. Starting up in Maine, we have already labeled the 1st District as safe D and the 2nd District as likely R, but we'll now be marking the statewide contest as likely D, awarding 2 electoral votes to Biden. Maine has voted blue in 8 straight elections, most recently by 9 points in 2020. Like I mentioned previously, statewide results here do tend to lean left due to the ideological alignment of its more urban and very well-educated 1st District, mirroring the rest of the solidly blue New England states, though it does tend to be more competitive. As I had mentioned earlier, the 2nd District is much more rural and less educated. Maine's statewide population is notably the least racially diverse and actually the oldest in terms of senior population as well in the entire country, which also helps Republicans be more competitive, as both of those demographics do tend to lean more conservative. Nevertheless, I do expect Biden to hold Maine in the Democratic corner by a margin of around 6 to 8 points here in 2024. Shifting to the west now, New Mexico also goes down as likely Democrat here. 2020 actually marked the first time since 1968 that New Mexico voted to the right of neighboring Colorado. It backed Democrats by 11 compared to 13.5 points up in Colorado. They did narrowly vote for George Bush in 2004, but have since backed Democratic candidates by margins between 5 to 12 percentage points in every election since. The fact that New Mexico is now generally considered to be less Democratic than Colorado can largely be attributed to its demographic profile. It is the 12th least educated state in the country in terms of proportion of residents with a college degree at 30%, which ranks the lowest of any Biden-won state in 2020 besides battleground Nevada. New Mexico is also the 15th most rural, which only ranks behind Vermont and Maine among the least urban Democratic states. It's also the only plurality Hispanic state in the U.S., and so if Republicans continue to gain ground with Hispanic voters, as we discussed over here in Texas, that could potentially make up some of their deficit, at least enough for me to project that it will remain in likely D territory around a D+7 to D+9 margin. Now, those two states bring Joe Biden's electoral vote tally up to 198, still trailing Trump's 219 in the race to 270. It is an extremely narrow margin separating the two candidates, reflecting how competitive the electoral college landscape is expected to be here in 2024, with just 121 electoral votes remaining in the 10 states that we have yet to assign a rating to. These are the 10 states that I expect to be most actively campaigned in this cycle, and ultimately end up being the 10 closest states once all of the votes are counted. Obviously, the margins themselves will vary from state to state, with some being much more competitive than others. In the Commonwealth of Virginia, for example, 13 electoral votes here will be added to Biden's tally as a lean Democrat state. Realistically, the Biden campaign will not have to spend that much time in Virginia for them to still win it by at least 4 to 5 points. I know there's been a lot of talk surrounding Virginia lately, as the last 3 polls surveyed here all showed Biden and Trump tied, but they feel like noise to me at this point. The fundamentals are just too strong for Democrats here, though primarily because of those polls, I have downgraded it here from likely Democrat to lean Biden here compared to my last video. Virginia did go from Clinton +5 in 2016 to Biden +10 in 2020, as Biden became the first Democrat to carry Virginia by a double-digit margin since FDR in 1944. This relatively strong and pretty rapid leftward trend is primarily due to the diversification of Northern Virginia, the D.C. suburbs, which, along with sliding suburban support across the entire state for Trump in that election, allowed Biden to win this once key battleground state without actively campaigning in it. Virginia had long been a reliable Republican state for decades, backing the GOP nominee in 13 of 14 presidential elections held between 1952 and 2004. Though following Barack Obama's victory in 2008, it has now gone blue in 4 straight cycles. Now, I am also going to label Minnesota as a lean Democrat, Nebraska's 2nd congressional district is leaning toward Biden, and then New Hampshire as well. And then for Donald Trump, we can label North Carolina as a leaning Republican. The electoral vote distributions here effectively cancel out, with 14 more votes added to Biden's tally, raising him to 226, and then 16 from North Carolina, raising him to 235. The states of Minnesota and New Hampshire have followed a very similar trend over the last decade or so. They both backed Obama by more than 5 points in 2012, and then narrowed significantly in 2016 as Clinton just barely held both states by 1.5% in Minnesota and 0.3% in New Hampshire, just a couple thousand votes separating the two candidates there. They then shifted back strongly, though, in favor of Biden in 2020 by 7-point margins each. Minnesota, surprisingly, holds the longest active streak of voting for Democratic candidates at 12 straight elections, while New Hampshire last voted Republican at the presidential level in the 2000 election. And although it has gone blue in 5 straight elections since, New Hampshire has consistently been the most competitive state in the Northeast since then. Looking ahead, though, to November 2024, Joe Biden currently leads Trump by 1.5% based on 14 presidential surveys in Minnesota, according to DDHQ and The Hill, and by 3.7% based on 9 polls in New Hampshire. Both averages are narrower than I expect the final outcome to be come November 5th. I think both will ultimately go to Biden by anywhere from 3 to 6 points once all of the votes are counted. As for Nebraska's 2nd District, attempts from Trump's allies to get rid of Nebraska's split electoral vote system failed in the state legislature, which does mean that Biden will have another great opportunity to extract an electoral vote away from Trump in a deep red state. This Omaha-based 2nd District is rapidly left trending, going from R+8 in 2012 to R+2 in 2016, and then D+7 in 2020. The district's lines were redrawn after the 2020 census to be slightly more favorable to Republicans, though Biden would still have won the current configuration by 6.3% in 2020. As for Trump now, over in the Tar Heel state, North Carolina has voted Republican in 3 straight presidential contests since Barack Obama's victory in 2008, and the GOP has simultaneously won 5 consecutive U.S. Senate races since then as well. Notably, though, all 8 of those federal elections were decided by less than 5 points, as North Carolina has established itself as a perennial purple state in major statewide races. Most recently, Trump carried North Carolina by just a point in 2020, but now here in 2024, Trump is leading Biden by an average of 5.2% based on 36 polls, added to the DDHQ and the Hill average. He has led in every single poll taken here in North Carolina, going all the way back to last March. Ultimately, I think we're likely to see Trump carry North Carolina this November by a similar margin to his 2016 win, around 3 to 4 points. Maybe he'll even push it to 5 in a very good environment. Cool, now with those 4 out of the way, we can finally dive into the 6 states that will matter more than any other in the race to 270. Joe Biden carried all 6 of these states by less than 3 percentage points in the 2020 election, after Trump had carried them all except for Nevada in 2016. Mathematically speaking, if Trump manages to flip back into his column any 4 out of these 6 states, he would be elected president with at least 270. That said, though, both candidates' most efficient path is through the Rust Belt. If Biden manages to hold Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, he will hit exactly 270 electoral votes, even if Trump sweeps the Sun Belt swing states. Conversely, if Trump flips these 3 states back into his column, as he did in 2016, he would hit 279. Though to be clear, Trump's most efficient path would be to win just Pennsylvania and Georgia, in which case he would hit exactly 270 electoral votes. So with all of that said, you can bet that these 6 states are circled in big red ink at the RNC and DNC headquarters at this very moment. Remember that in 2020, the margins in Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin were each less than 1%, with a combined total of less than 45,000 votes separating Biden and Trump in these states out of more than 11 million cast. Had Trump persuaded just about 45,000 voters to back him instead of Biden in these 3 states, he would be serving a 2nd term right now. That is how close the 2020 election was, and 2024 may be even closer. Alrighty, with that said, let's get into my personal predictions for the most likely outcomes across these states. Remember that while I am keeping current polling data in mind, these predictions are not dated to if this election were held today. They are based on how I believe the election held on November 5th, 2024 will turn out. Starting in Nevada, there are numerous positive indicators for Republicans here, even as Democrats have dominated statewide elections since Barack Obama's 13-point victory in 2008. Nevada has shifted 5 points in favor of Republicans relative to the nation since 2012, and it ranks 44th out of the 50 U.S. states in terms of the proportion of residents with a college degree. That's the lowest of any state that Biden won in 2020. Most recently, in the 2022 midterms, the GOP flipped the governor's office, flipping it from blue to red, and came within a point of defeating a relatively popular Democratic incumbent senator in that election as well. Republicans also received more votes for U.S. House than Democrats in those midterms for the first time in decades. As for current polling ahead of 2024, perhaps no other state has trended more positively for Trump than Nevada, where he currently leads by 1.9% based on 36 polls in DDHQ and the Hills average. This is his narrowest advantage since he first took the lead last October. He had previously been leading by around 4 to 6 points. But if we do expand this race out to RFK Jr. and others, Trump's lead expands to 3.5% based on 23 polls. That's significant because Kennedy has indeed qualified for the ballot in Nevada. Now, of course, it's hard to say whether Trump will actually end up winning by such a large margin in November. Even just a Trump plus 3-point victory would be an impressive 5-point swing from Biden plus 2 in 2020. Ultimately, though, while I do think a Trump victory is slightly more likely than not at this point, say 55 to 60%, that's no better than a toss-up. I'm downgrading Nevada from tilt Republican to the toss-up category, as the polling here has started to trend more positively towards Biden over the last few weeks. Let's move on to Arizona now, though, where Biden won by only 0.3% in 2020. Democrats have now won 4 straight federal contests for president and Senate, and the most recent race for governor as well. Arizona had long been a reliable Republican state leading up to 2020, as Republican presidential candidates had carried Arizona in 16 of 17 presidential elections. Yet their dominance did begin to show cracks at the start of the 21st century, and over the last 24 years or so, Arizona has rapidly trended towards the political center in American politics. And this has been primarily driven by the Republican Party's eroding support among college-educated white voters, as well as rising turnout from Latinos and Native Americans, and the explosive population growth and diversification of Phoenix, the fastest-growing metro area in the entire country. Much like Clark County encompassing the Las Vegas metro region in Nevada, Maricopa County encompassing Phoenix in Arizona is the single biggest factor in determining statewide elections here, as it contains about 2/3 of Arizona's population. Biden became the first Democrat to receive the most votes in Maricopa since 1952, and the split, 50.3% to 48.1%, with Biden's raw vote lead of 45,000 votes, that was just enough to overcome the slight Republican edge across the rest of the state to help Biden win by 11,000 votes, 49.4% to 49.1%. Looking ahead to 2024 now, though, the polling trends in Arizona and Nevada have been mirroring each other very closely. That was at least until recently, as while Nevada has shifted to Biden over the last 2 weeks or so, Arizona has trended a couple points back in Trump's direction now at 4.8%, based on 51 polls, 49.2% to 44.4%. Trump has pretty much led by around this much for 3 or so months. His odds at this point, in my mind, are becoming more favorable than they are in Nevada, somewhere between 60 to 70% in my mind right now, enough to keep it as a tilt Republican state here. Now, if Trump does continue to lead by almost 5 points in the polls past Labor Day, I may be more inclined to say that it leans that way, but we'll see. Now, moving all the way across the Sunbelt region over to Georgia, another state that Biden won by a very narrow margin in 2020, 0.2%, with a raw vote margin of less than 12,000. Yet once again, Trump is polling very well in Georgia. His current lead over Biden in a head-to-head race is 4.3%, based on 39 polls. It's been a consistent lead of around 4 to 8 points all cycle. Georgia, like Arizona, has shifted strongly towards Democrats over the last decade at the presidential level, going from Romney plus 8 in 2012 to Trump plus 5 in 2016, and then Biden plus 0.2 in 2020. It is still a conservative state at heart, though, one in which incumbent Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock was recently forced into a runoff in the 2022 midterms against Herschel Walker, who's objectively one of the weakest Republican Senate candidates in recent memory. Biden's breakthrough in 2020 and the Democrats' subsequent Senate victories in January of 2021 were no doubt significant, but they were mostly driven by strong support and turnout from non-whites, and early 2024 polls showed Trump gaining among both Black and Hispanic voters, while voter enthusiasm is significantly lower than it was in 2020. Because of these factors, it does seem the tides are turning back to Trump here, as betting market odds do give the former president a 60. His best odds in any of these 6 key states. I've got Georgia leaning towards Trump now, shifting a little deeper into his column from tilt Republican in my last update. Now that leaves us with the absolutely critical Rust Belt trio of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. As you can see in the updated Electoral college count in the race to 270, even if Trump sweeps the key Sunbelt states, he still only reaches 268 electoral votes, meaning that if Biden can hold on to Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, the three battlegrounds that he has consistently been polling the least bad in so far this cycle, he would still win re-election with exactly 270 electoral votes. And this remarkably mirrors the dynamics of the last two elections, as had Hillary Clinton held them in the Democratic column in 2016, she would have defeated Trump, and had Trump held them in his corner in 2020, he would have won a second term. I do generally tend to analyze Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania as a trio because their voting history and demographic profiles are just so similar. Historically speaking, this trio is often considered ancestrally Democratic due to that strong presence of white working-class voters that had previously made up the backbone of the Democratic electorate for most of the late 20th century. They had each voted blue in these 6 presidential elections between 1988 and then 2016, when Trump narrowly flipped them into his column due to his emerging appeal among non-college white voters in this region. It was this same appeal that made recent Midwest swing states like Ohio, Indiana, Iowa, and even Missouri go from Obama-era purple states to now being reliably Republican. Now, the Upper Rust Belt trio did flip back in favor of Biden in 2020 due to aversion against Trump among college-educated voters in the region, especially suburban women. Demographically speaking, they each rank very closely in terms of racial diversity and educational attainment. Wisconsin is the 12th whitest state and ranks 29th in educational attainment, where Michigan ranks 20th and 33rd, while Pennsylvania ranks 19th and 24th in those categories, respectively. Now, in 2024, it's truly anyone's guess as to how they will vote next. On the one hand, widespread backlash against the Supreme Court's decision to strike down Roe v. Wade had rallied Democrats up and down the ballot in key races here in 2022 and in 2023. They swept the governor's contests in all 3 states in the midterms, significantly outperforming polling expectations in each of those races, and in both Wisconsin and Pennsylvania Senate contests as well. We saw John Fetterman and Mandela Barnes beat their final polling averages by 5 and 3 points, respectively, though Barnes still came up short against Republican incumbent Ron Johnson. Perhaps even more notable than those results, though, a highly politicized Wisconsin Supreme Court election that almost entirely revolved around abortion rights in 2023 went the liberal justice's way by 11 points. Now, Sunbelt states are generally more religious and thus more socially conservative than the Rust Belt trio. A Pew Research Center survey found that in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, adults favoring the legality of abortion in all or most cases exceed those opposing it by margins of 12, 7, and 8 percentage points, respectively. In contrast, this support is narrower in Arizona and North Carolina at 3 and 4 points, and then it reverses in Georgia, where opponents outnumber supporters by 1 point. That being said, despite some economic indicators rebounding over the last couple months, a majority of voters in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania still hold very negative views on the state of the economy, according to polling data. And history tells us that incumbent presidents' re-election odds are heavily tied to how voters feel about their personal financial situations at the time of the election. The economy always tops voters' key issues, especially in this part of the country. So in order for Biden to hold on to these states, he will need voters' economic outlooks to improve quickly. Like I did say previously, though, the polling in these 3 states has been less disastrous consistently for the president than in the Sunbelt region. In Michigan, Trump's overall lead is 0.4% based on 53 polls, 48.6%, 48.2%. And contrary to what we saw in the Sunbelt, Trump's lead does not change when including RFK Jr. and other third parties, not pictured here, remaining at 0.4% based on 34 polls. The key takeaway here, though, is that both averages do show Biden and Trump are essentially statistically tied here, as those are well within the margin of error. Betting markets have tended to give Biden a slight edge due to recent voting trends and demographics, but there's no way that anybody can say that Michigan is anything but a toss-up right now, and therefore I am downgrading it from tilt Democrat. Now let's take a look at the average in Wisconsin. Biden leads Trump by 0.2%, according to 37 polls in DDHQ's latest average. Wisconsin's timeline shows that it has been incredibly close for quite some time now. Biden has consistently polled the best here out of the trio, which is interesting as it has voted to the right of both Michigan and Pennsylvania in the last few presidential cycles. And on that note, in Pennsylvania, Trump leads by his widest margin of the three, 2%, based on 54 polls. 49.2% to 47.2%. Ultimately, these averages simply suggest that the races here remain 50-50. You'd be grasping at partisan straws to suggest that either Biden or Trump has a better than 60% chance in either state, which currently remains my threshold to keep Wisconsin and Pennsylvania in the toss-up column. So this is the closest I think I can get in terms of rating each state ahead of November's election. Donald Trump is favored to win the presidency with 262 electoral votes over Biden's 226. Though neither candidate officially reaches 270 in this projection, with 50 electoral votes out of Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania all labeled as toss-ups for now. Anyways, that does it for this 2024 presidential election map prediction and analysis. Let me know whether you agree or disagree with these ratings in the comments below. Shout out to my channel members on screen here. Thank you so much for your support. If you would like to become a member, go ahead and click the join button below this video to receive exclusive perks. Finally, be sure to check out electionpredictionsofficial.com for my latest 2024 forecast. You can also support my channel by donating via the link to my PayPal in the comments below. Check out more content from my channel here, and as always, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. EP out.